We may get started. I will give you a brief introduction to today's webinar, Tipping Points for Sustainability Transitions, which is one out of a series of webinars in the ramp up for our Nobel Prize Summit. Some of you may have seen the webpage at Nobel Foundation. Nobel Prize Summit, Our Planet, Our Future, is co-organized by the National Academy of Sciences in the US, PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Stockholm Resilience Center, and the Bayer Institute under the auspices of the Nobel Foundation. As you can see on the website, the main stage, as we call it, is taking place from 26 to 28 April. You can all register there. There's a lot of exciting events going on before, during the summit, and we also keep things online after the summit. Our idea is really to gather the best available science, Earth system science, sustainability science around the themes climate, biosphere, equality, and technological transitions, again, to move from knowledge to action. And in that same vein, we also hold today's webinar on tipping points, a concept that has been known for some time and which has been, how to say, scaled up to the global scale by Hans Schellnhuber and Tim Lenton more than 10 years ago with a tipping elements concept about which we will hear more. John and Tim will be our first two speakers today as well. They will focus, or let's say John will give us an introduction and refer to the urgency of the situation. Tim will give us a short introduction more to the biophysical side of tipping points, the scale across scales. You may think of examples like the Amazon that has such two stable states and may switch rapidly, maybe in a nonlinear fashion from one state, rainforest, to another, say savanna state under pressure such as climate and land use change. Similarly, we will then have, there will be a short presentation by Timothy, followed by a discussion between him and Jonathan Donges from PIC. After that, we move to socioeconomic and political tipping points, briefly presented by Cameron Hepburn, and then moving to a discussion with Ilona Otto from University of Graz. There are many of these socioeconomic and political tipping points. Think of rapid shift to e-mobility, think of divestment movement, think of political rapid shifts in the 90s in Eastern Europe. We'll hear more about that. We want to use the concept, we want to drive it to positive change, positive upward tipping, as Tim may explain it to us. Can we anticipate these rapid changes? Can we even navigate them, navigate the new positive stable states? And where are intervention points, where to intervene to use them in a positive way? So after that more scientific introduction, we will have reflections on the one hand from the policy side, by Manjana Milkoreit from Oslo University. Unfortunately, the announced other speaker on the policy side, Marta Delgado Peralta from Mexico, couldn't make it today. And then we'll have another reflection from the business sector, from Peter Bakker from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. After that, we'll have a panel discussion, depending on how long it takes us to get through the program. We should have something like 45 minutes of, half an hour, 45 minutes of panel discussion. And all that will be moderated by Oliver Morton from The Economist, to whom I will hand over in a second. Just to emphasize once more for anyone coming in newly, please feel free to use the chat function to send us your questions and comments. And we'll try to address as many of them as we can during the panel discussion in particular. With that, I would like to hand over to Oliver, who will guide us through the program and guide us also through the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Holger, and thank you all for coming. My normal duty of pointing out where the fire exits are is obviated this week. I hope you know how to get out of your own homes in the case of fire. But all my other duties are intact, and I will happily undertake them. The first of which is the canonical introduction for someone who needs no introduction, in this case, John Schellnhuber. John Schellnhuber was the founding director of PIC, and turned it from, well, because it was founding nothing, into one of the leading climate research institutes in the world. If you've been frightened by a potential impact of climate change in the past 20 years, and if you haven't been frightened by a potential impact of climate change, you haven't been paying attention, then John may well have had something to do with it. And he's warned us all repeatedly about various aspects of climate change, and was also very early, as Holger said, into the idea of looking at these non-linearities or tipping points in the climate system. So to kick us off, there really could be no one better for this job than John. Over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me see. Okay, I hope you can see the screen now, my presentation. Juliana, is it okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Oliver, thanks a lot for your very British introduction and giving me all the blame for people being scared about climate change, but rightly so. Actually, this is a slide which I used as the cover slide in a presentation I gave in Katowice, one of the past climate conventions, COPs, in 2018, and the title is precisely Climate Impacts. It's the non-linearities to it, actually. And this is, as a mathematical physicist, I have tried to preach all my scientific life that we cannot linearize the complex world around us. We have to really deal about the disruptions and so on. So in that very year, just before that Katowice event, we had, let me see if I can move it. Yes, here. We had the report, the 1.5 degrees centigrade report by the IPCC, global warming of 1.5 degrees. And this actually was driving home the message that dangerous climate change is just around the corner. So the tipping elements or the tipping points concept is actually, and that's a broad conclusion, helps us to, number one, define in scientific terms what is dangerous climatic change. That means this is operationalizing the famous Article 2 of the Climate Convention. So that's number one, and I will show how that happens. And the second, maybe even more important question is, how far are we away from dangerous climate change? And the overall story of tipping points is too big to be told in a few minutes. It has made a world career in a way, and initially nobody thought of that. But in the IPCC report, you have the following presentation here, the slide chart, which is actually giving you the creeps, because it means we introduced in the third assessment report of the IPCC this notion of large-scale singular events. That's on the right-hand side. But in general, the reasons for concern, a sort of colorful way of presenting our approach to dangerous climatic change that has become world famous, although it was a very slight innovation at that time. But what you see if you focus on the right-hand side is that when we first used this colorful presentation of how close are we actually to something which is really, really worrying. So you see in the TAR third assessment report in 2001, when we talked about large-scale singular events like the breakdown of the thermaline circulation or the shift of monsoon system, we thought, well, this would become dangerous around 4 degrees warming. You see the yellow color there. And then yes, it would be really, really serious at 6 degrees warming. That means more or less never, because nobody was expecting that this would ever happen. Now you go along the line. So there has been this paper in PNAS by Smith et al. When you have the AR5, fifth assessment report, the color is coming down, and it's quite dramatic, color coming down at the special report on 1.5 degrees, where you see, and this has been corroborated by many, many publications now, that between 1 and 2 degrees, you enter already the danger zone, which means we are just half a degree centigrade away from dangerous climatic change. So the next slide is a slide which I presented in a slightly different form a long time ago, actually in the year 2001, at a lecture I gave at Oxford University, tipping elements in the Earth system. So what are the vital organs of the planetary machinery, and how could they be disrupted? So you see, of course, the big ecosystems, you see the thermaline circulation in the Atlantic, you see the jet stream, another circulation pattern, and you see the big ice sheets, of course. And at that time, we thought most of these elements would never be touched by human interference, in particular East Antarctic ice sheet. I mean, even when I talked at the time to the British Antarctic Survey, they said, calm down, this will never be perturbed, so to speak, by anthropogenic global warming. But the story has changed a lot, actually. Now we are quite nervous about it. This is the iconic example of thermaline circulation. There have been hundreds of papers on that. This is a recent paper published as a brief communication, I think in Nature Geoscience, yeah, right. And it's telling us that actually we have a clear-cut sort of weakening of the thermaline circulation or Gulf Stream. And if there is a further weakening of about 40%, the system may be tipped actually into a shutdown, into a lockdown of the thermaline circulation with major implications for example, weather conditions in Europe. So this is a chart that actually tells you precisely where is the danger zone and how far are we away from it. And why is the Paris Agreement so reasonable? So that's a paper we published in 2016. Myself, Ricardo Winkelmann, Stefan Ramsdorff in Nature Climatic Change. And it's telling you all the story. So you see the time frame is from 20,000 years before our period to the year 2500. You see the various RCP scenarios, where we would take us actually in terms of temperature. So RCP 8.5 by the year 2500 could take us to more than 8 degrees warming. So that would be complete disaster. But also the other ones would take us far outside the Holocene conditions. And you see the Paris range, the corridor 1.5 to 2 degrees as a gray bar, so to speak, horizontal bar. And when you see at that time, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, our best guess based on the various literature entries where the various tipping sort of bars are, where the corridors are. So you have on the left-hand side the West Antarctic ice sheet, where some parts have been tipped already. Greenland, yeah, it can start at 1.5 degrees, but probably rather at 3 degrees warming. But very sadly, the coral reefs, 1.5 degrees is already starting the demise. When you see all the other tipping elements, Amazonian rainforest, boreal forest, thermaline circulation, just discussed, ENSO, and finally the East Antarctic ice sheet. And the clear story is, by the way the wiggly line is measured, global mean temperature since 20,000 years ago. The sad but clear-cut story is the following. The Paris range, the Paris Agreement serves as a firewall separating us from some of the worst tipping dynamics, like the meltdown of the East Antarctic ice sheet, which would add 40 or 50 meters sea level to sea level. But some of the elements, in particular the Western Arctic ice sheet or the coral reefs, we are approaching them, or we have already destabilized parts of them. So that's the chart. So all the Paris Agreement can do, if it is implemented at all, it can separate us from the worst tipping dynamics that are in store. But even worse, a paper lead authored by Will Steffen, but many of the people here on this call, Tim Lenton and Owen Rockström and Jonathan Donges and so on, that paper became iconic in a way, Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene, which tells us two things actually, which add up to the worries about tipping points, is that there might be an interaction, or there will be an interaction of the various tipping dynamics. So if you melt down the Greenland ice sheet, then of course this has a major implication on the thermoline circulation, and this is changing the weather conditions in the Amazonian basin and so on. So there are cascades of interactions really. And the second thing is that, and this is a really worrying thing, if we emit just enough CO2, for example, to push the Earth to 2 degrees warming and then stop emitting, do we have any guarantee that the Earth system stays put at the 2 degrees warming, or whether we have put it on a slippery slope where after centuries it will just glide away into 4 degrees, 6 degrees warming into a hothouse state? And this question has not been answered yet, actually. We just assume the Earth system will stay put with 2 degrees warming. So all these things have to be discussed. So finally, how far are we away, and can we still intervene? And this was an article published in The Guardian on a little math we have introduced in a paper, actually, that was this paper here in Nature, published in November 2019, Climate Tipping Points Too Risky to Bet Against. But I'm coming back to this. We introduced a little bit of math in order to try to define what a climate emergency is. And of course, we use the usual risk analysis as insurers use. Risk is the damage multiplied by the event probability. And if the damage is very big and if the event probability is very small, you still have a considerable risk. If P is 1, then you have certainty, so the damage will occur. But when you look at the different kin, so to speak, controllers in a tower at an airport, they have a different definitions of urgency, or they have a definition of urgency, namely, it's the reaction time still left if 2 planes are on a collision course with each other. So it's the reaction time still left to communicate with the pilots, so we can change course, divided, so the reaction time is the time left, and the intervention time. So to get it right, because everybody gets puzzled. So the reaction time is the time you need in order to avoid a collision. So to send the message to the pilots and so on. The intervention time is the time you still have actually for sending the signal and to turn around the system. And so in the Titanic case, it is said that about a minute left and the captain did nothing to react. So he lost control immediately. And you see here, if the reaction time and the intervention time become equal, you have lost control. This can be applied. We can actually play around with it to climate change. And given the tipping points we have in store, actually, we have still an intervention time of probably 30 years, but the reaction time is similar, actually. So we are about to lose control right now. So this was said already. The big hope is now the following. If there is non-linearity in the biogeophysical system, the tipping dynamics, We can only beat this nonlinearity with the nonlinearity in the social system. As you heard, if we have 30 years to turn the tide, some disruptive innovations and some social movements have to start, which actually beat in the end the physical nonlinearity. And this is precisely what Ilona, Otto, and others have raised in a paper which I guess will become famous, Social Tipping Dynamics for Stabilizing Earth's Climate by 2015, which was published last year in PNAS. So that's my introduction. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the contributions by the colleagues. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, John. The next presentation or paired presentation will be from Tim Lenton and Jonathan Dongas. Tim is the director of the Global Systems Institute and the chair in climate change and earth system science at the University of Exeter. He's got renown as a modeler, as someone who is very interested in nonlinear mathematics, but at the same time, as someone who has studied deeply the history of the Earth and the things that have mattered most, including nonlinearities there. And I greatly recommend his book on the subject, Revolutions in Earth History, which is written with Andy Watson. The interesting thing for in this context is that Earth history tells you a lot about these instabilities and how they can influence the world. And now that that an instability is influencing the world and is under human influence, though not, as I think Ron pointed out, as control, this has become a key issue. So Tim is going to speak, and then afterwards he and Jonathan are going to have a talk. Jonathan is co-leader of the Future Lab on Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene. Earth resilience and sustainability is his main thing, which he pursues also at Stockholm in the Resilience Centre and at Princeton. And so they will talk a bit after Tim has given his presentation, and then we will move on to those social tipping points that John was just outlining for us in a hopeful way.
Thanks, Ollie. You hearing me okay? Seeing the slides, people? Yeah, great.
Yes.
So I might be jumping the gun, but I am going to talk about the bad climate tipping points, but also get on to how we indeed need to tip positive change to avoid those bad climate tipping points. And I will try to show not only are we running this risk of what we might call an upward scaling tipping cascade in the climate system, a risk we have to avoid at all costs. But if we're going to avoid it, as John has hinted, we need to find and trigger some upward scaling tipping cascades in social, economic, technological systems. So I'll start with a little toy model of a system with alternative stable states. And in a minute, it's going to get tipped from one to the other. It's being forced for our purposes by climate change, and that's destabilizing the state it started in. And interestingly, before the tipping point happens, there are some pretty generic early warning signals that it's coming. You would have seen the ball was rolling around a little bit slower before the major catastrophe happened. And we spent a lot of time in the last decade or so showing that that generic early warning signal of slowing down of recovery from perturbations can be picked up in cases before past abrupt climate changes and in all sorts of complex dynamical systems approaching tipping points. And that's one of the kind of generic ways that we've, along with some other things like direct observation and sophisticated climate modeling, that has allowed us to get some refined information on the tipping elements that John introduced a minute ago. And this was a short summary of kind of the state of knowledge on some of the key climate tipping elements and how they're experiencing accelerating change. But also, as hinted by the orange arrows, that we begin to see the direct evidence from the Earth system of causal coupling and interactions between the tipping elements. So to give an example, not only the Arctic is warming up 2 or 3 times the global average rate, thanks to the retreat of the sea ice exposing the dark ocean surface, absorbing more sunlight and adding to the warming, But that heating of the Arctic is accelerating the melt of the Greenland ice sheet. The meltwater pouring off Greenland into the North Atlantic on either side is contributing to this weakening of the Atlantic circulation that John highlighted. And we know from Earth's history that when we weaken that circulation, it drags the band of rainfall all the way around the tropics southwards, and that disrupts the monsoons in West Africa, around the planet in India. It also does less transferring of heat from the southern to the northern hemisphere, and leaving heat behind in the Southern Ocean is contributing arguably already to the destabilization of the West Antarctic ice sheet and some parts of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So in simple terms, not only have we got the risk of individual tipping points being crossed in the climate system, and some of them perhaps already passed now in the case of West Antarctica, but we also have this larger risk of triggering the wrong kind of tipping cascade. Now, I just wanted to say a word about how does this affect our economic analysis of the climate problem. Arguably, we need a deeper analysis than an economic one, but given that the Biden administration has just reinvigorated the policy instrument of using or signing a social cost of carbon emissions and using it throughout federal decisions in the US, it's perhaps worth knowing that in past work, when we put the best available knowledge on the likelihood of climate tipping points into a well-known so-called integrated assessment model, the model called DICE that Bill Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for a couple of years ago, it completely changes the model results. When you recognize the risk of future climate tipping points, it increases what the model returns as the present day social cost of carbon emissions, the damages they're going to cause. It increases that by about an order of magnitude. And this completely transforms the policy recommendation for the model. Instead of recommending that we try to stabilize at 3 degrees of global warming, what's called the social planner in the model goes into overdrive, doing everything in their power to shut down fossil fuel burning and greenhouse gas emissions, and actually succeeds in limiting warming to below 1.5 degrees. Interestingly, when you put the interactions between the tipping points into the model and the risk of cascades, this can further abruptly increase the social cost of carbon. For example, in the case I've already hinted at, where we got good scientific physical evidence to support the idea that if we start triggering the meltdown of the Greenland ice sheet, this increases the risk of a really damaging tipping point, collapsing that Atlantic overturning circulation. So enough of the bad news and enough of the bad tipping cascades. I was going to turn my attention to getting us talking about how could we find and trigger positive tipping cascades that cascade upscales in our social systems and our relationship with technology and all the things we need to reach sustainability. There are many relevant reinforcing feedbacks that can help us in this. One of them I'll highlight here is a phenomenon that academics call social contagion. We have a habit of copying what our neighbors do, and in a virtual world we have many neighbors these days, and this has been shown to be contributing to the rapid uptake of new technologies like solar photovoltaic panels on the roofs of houses. I'm going to show you a little movie of some data from part of the US. This is in Colorado, where you're seeing not just the initial purchasers but their neighbors copying them over about a 3 or 4 year interval in the early 2010s. And this phenomenon of social contagion of sustainable technology uptake is also beginning to be seen for electric vehicles. And recently, in looking at the data across Europe, at least, for market share uptake of electric vehicles, EVs, as a function here on the x-axis of the difference in price between an EV or a petrol or diesel car, the non-linearity is pretty striking, isn't it? The one country where now electric vehicles actually dominate the market, in Norway, it's got a radically different situation where basically it's the same price to the purchaser to buy an EV as a petrol or diesel car, thanks to some clever policy incentives. That completely changes the situation, even compared to the Netherlands, that seems to be very close to this tipping point of price parity. And the good news as we look ahead is through a fantastic reinforcing feedback that we all know as economies of scale, the more battery packs that gets made, the cheaper the next one gets to make. And that's the crucial thing that's determining the cost of an electric vehicle, and is coming down all the time. Depending on your projection, within 3 years, we'll see electric vehicles cheaper to make than petrol or diesel cars, and then they'll go on to carry on being even cheaper. And I'm quietly confident that should lead to an upward scaling tipping cascade for electrification of personal mobility. And what I'm really interested in, I've been working on with Simon Sharp in the COP26 team, working towards the next conference of the parties, is well, what can trigger these upward scaling positive tipping cascades to happen sooner? Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion, which jurisdictions should get together to make this one happen sooner, but also how tipping in one sector of the economy could really enable and cascade and trigger tipping in other sectors of the economy. I sketch a few possibilities here on a sort of bifurcations map, if you like, and it's something that the COP26 team are actively working on with their clean transport campaign. The one thing I'll finish on is the thought that as we get more and more and cheaper battery storage, this is really going to enable the transition to renewable power, because the crucial challenge there is to have some cheap form of storage to balance out the imbalance between the times when renewable electricity is generated from the sun shining and the wind blowing, and the times when it's demanded by consumers. And for that, you need cheap storage, and the battery revolution and the electric vehicle revolution is going to help enable that. And then that transition in clean power is going to feed back in to the electrification of transport, because of course, if your electricity source is renewable for your electrified transport, you get the best possible outcome for the climate. So in other words, there are these cascades that are starting to show their face, if you like, across sectors of the global economy. And I hope that as we switch to the discussion, I hope that gives us a sense of some plausible grounds for hope that we might be able to find and activate some positive tipping cascades to avoid the bad climate tipping cascades. Thanks very much. Now, Jonathan, we're going to have a chat.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim, for that presentation. So yeah, I would like to start, I think, or kick this off with going back to the risk analysis perspective, to the that you showed, but also that John showed, and kind of this perspective of the let's say the insurer and the perspective of the controller. And I'm interested in your perspective on what are even let's say underrated risks regarding tipping points that are not yet included in these results that you show. So I mean, if we think of something like black swans or even unknown unknowns, so particularly in systems that are maybe not yet as well understood in the Earth system context, like biosphere integrity. What is the risk of such things? What is known? I mean, what do you think is the research or science needed to learn more about this?
Wow. Well, I'm glad you highlighted the biosphere there, Jonathan, because frankly, several of us here come from a tradition of a system thinking and modeling, but we well know that our climate models are just that. They were built out of weather forecast models, and it's taken a very long time, and we're still on the journey to even begin to adequately represent life in those models. And yet I think we can all intuitively grasp the idea that other life forms are a critical part of our life support system, recycling all the nutrients and elements we need, the oxygen we need to breathe, etc., etc. So you're right, I think, to highlight that there are probably some very important things missing from our mental radar, in the sense that we're simply not including them in the tools that we use to determine, to make some policy decisions and action here. But I guess the crucial point then is we have to have we have to act under that kind of uncertainty. Some would maybe call it ambiguity, but we haven't necessarily had the right, in my view, been taking the right policy and decision framework to this huge question of basically this existential question of the current climate and ecological emergency. And we better wise up fast and start using all inbuilt and evolved risk management capabilities appropriately, because we have those and we can use them. And if I said a word more, it would be to remind us of what John hinted at, which is if you rewind to when John and I and many others came together to draw up our original tipping elements map, as John said, we never had the Wilkes Basin in East Antarctica on the map, 3 or 4 meters of global sea level rise, and an element that I would definitely put on the map now because we got direct evidence it might be beginning to undergo an irreversible grounding line retreat. So that just shows you in 10 years, things can, new empirical evidence can put new things on the map as well as sharpen our view on old ones. And we've just got to expect that that'll continue to be the case as we go forwards. There'll be things we miss that are significant risks. So we need to kick in our innate risk aversion. And
yeah, and one particular process in, let's stay with the climate system for a little bit, that seems to have been a bit understudied in the past is rate-induced tipping points, right? That where not only the magnitude of global warming is critical, but also the rate, the rate of change. And there's recent evidence for the AMOC again with the complex ocean model that shows this. So how do you think more is to be expected?
yeah, I do. But interestingly, studies in the 1990s that maybe several people have forgotten showed that the AMOC, the Atlantic overturning, had a rate dependent threshold. Tom Stocker and others showed that. And it's actually, from the point of view of those of us who dare study dynamical systems, it's actually quite an intuitive thing that there would be a rate dependence of these tipping points. And even if we rewind to the foundations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the whole idea of trying to define dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, if you actually go back into the history of that, the idea of rate of climate change being absolutely critically dangerous was right in there at the start, and arguably it got filtered out pretty early on, presumably on some argument that it was too complicated for policymakers to get their head around. Well, take your own view on that.
May I just confirm that, because that's an important point. Actually, when in 1994, 1995, when the first conference of the parties, COP1, was held in Berlin, Angela Merkel was actually the chair of that conference. Then the German Advisory Council on Global Change presented so-called tolerable windows approach, where we came up actually with a temperature range and a temperature change range, both things, a two-dimensional diagram. And it was clearly, as Tim said, filtered out because it was too complex for politicians. They said, go away with that. I don't understand that. So in the end, only the temperature guardrail survived.
And it amazes me because I think anyone would intuitively, in my head, get the thought that when you think about life and you know anything about evolution and adaptation, it feels totally intuitive that the faster the environment or the world is changing, the harder it's going to be for evolution and arguably ecology and movement of species, etc., to keep up or catch up. I mean, you don't have to be a genius for far from it to intuitively grasp that. So I think it's a bit of a travesty that fell out of the policy discourse so early.
Well, maybe it's now the time to bring this back in. Maybe a final point on how do you think? I mean, you hinted at that with your positive social tipping, but how resilient are societies currently to these risks, and how could this resilience be improved? I mean, is is establishing a huge early warning system, would that be something that you would advise to policymakers to monitor all these systems?
Well, I mean, my inner optimist that wants to believe in a world of evidence-based policy making has probably for 10 years been gently suggesting that you could get a very good return on investment on deploying and developing a tipping point early warning system. But I'm under no illusions that we actually live in that world. As someone put it to me earlier today, we often see policy-based evidence making after the fact. So yes, we could do that, but that relies on a level of faith in human foresight and planning that we have very little direct empirical evidence to back up that we're really great at doing that. I hate to be so blunt. And the current COVID crisis only sort of serves to illustrate that. Maybe the analogy for sure isn't perfect. So yeah, I believe in that there is some traction to evidence-based policy and that would add some useful information, but I've gained no traction really in 10 years persuading people that will be a worthwhile investment. I can carry on trying to persuade them, but I certainly have decided that the right effort, intellectual effort for me now is perhaps just to directly identify these opportunities for the positive tipping points. Because frankly, from where I'm sitting, we don't need more science to tell us how big the risks are that we're running. We need more science to tell us how on earth can we accelerate the change we need to avoid the worst.
Thanks, Tim. So I hand back over to Oliver, right?
Yes, I think I'll wind that up there. That was absolutely fascinating. So we're now moving, interestingly, without a sharp change in the curve of the function, we are moving, it seems to me, into the socioeconomic tipping points, which goes slightly against the grain given the nature of our talk, but there we go. We're going to hear first from Cameron Hepburn, who, if you draw a Venn diagram of Oxford with idea clusters around economics, the environment, the new and the enterprising, right in the middle of it all, you will find Cameron, who directs the Economics of Sustainability program and the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and is also a professor of environmental economics. He has degrees in law, engineering, and economics, but that hasn't stopped him from publishing with repute in biology and philosophy and public policy. And he's co-founded businesses, he's not all talk, and advises governments. And we will look forward to hearing his talk, followed by response and conversation with Ilona Otto, who is actually a true social scientist by training in all her academic work, and now professor of societal impacts of climate change at the University of Graz, where she leads a research group focused on social complexity and system transformation, and she is part of Cascades, the innovatively named program on cascading climate risks within the Horizon 2000 project. So first Cameron, and then Cameron and Ilona.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Very generous and warm introduction from you. And thanks to the organizers, great presentations from John and Tim to follow. I couldn't agree more. And you've just been leaders with Ilona as well in this field. It's so important what we're discussing today, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I'm going to very briefly talk about some of our work in the UK on tipping points or sensitive intervention points as we were referring to them. The difference simply really being stemming from the basis of complex system science that my colleagues Doan Farmer and friends at the Institute of New Economic Thinking at Oxford have been relying upon. I don't want to do too much with you. Tim's done some great examples of how we can get this right and how we can beat John's negative, or at least unfortunate, shall I say, feedback loops with some more fortunate and happy positive feedback loops. If you want to read some more about our work, you can start with the piece in Science in 2019 and a more recent piece just towards the end of last year for the Committee on Climate Change in the UK which identified 40 of these socioeconomic tipping points, or socioeconomic technical tipping points, in 9 categories. And I guess zooming out, I'm only going to deal with 2 of them today, very briefly, given time. But if you're seeking to look at some of the generalities here, quite a lot of them, well, all of them have positive reinforcement mechanisms, amplification or feedback to some degree. Many of them involve beliefs, because beliefs have a habit of spreading in a viral fashion quite quickly, and they also have a habit of becoming self-fulfilling. So if everybody believes that we will be in a clean energy system, there is very little point investing in a dirty energy system. And so, of course, everybody invests in a clean energy system, and thence you have a clean energy system. So beliefs is a key feature here, as are these other various feedback loops. Technologies, which Tim has identified, also play an important role, but so too do decisions made in civil society with protest group, which John was identifying. The law, legal actions can have this feedback effect to them. Once you get a couple of cases setting precedents, you can get a flood of cases, and that's what we're seeing. And capital flows themselves also have a habit of, moving in a sheep-like dynamic. So I'll leave you, if you're interested, to read more about that in the paper. I wanted to just pick off 2, perhaps 2 unusual ones, or one unusual one. The first one is that some of these intervention points happen exogenous to us. You can't really expect them, but these things are going to happen. And we've just had a big one. We've had a pandemic. It wasn't kind of in the plan. But I think part of what our community needs to be doing is to be ready for such events, ready to go, so that we can make the most use of these exogenous events and harness the dynamics within them. So the COVID-19 pandemic created this potential for a sensitive intervention, because there were trillions that we knew as soon as it started to happen would be allocated to rescuing and then recovering our economies. And so far in 2020, we saw 15 trillion allocated, not necessarily spent yet, but allocated. Of that, almost 2 trillion was devoted to longer term measures rather than simply bailing out, rescuing people's livelihoods and companies and so on. And through a program that we've launched at Oxford, led by Brian O'Callaghan, classifying all of these measures from all around the world, it's a big job. We can see that around 18% of that has been green so far. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves us saying, well, this could have been a major tipping point, because if you spend 15 trillion in a green fashion, then a lot of other things follow. Now, we were never going to spend all 15 trillion, but you could reasonably have thought that of the 2 trillion recovery, and of course there's more coming, that's prior to the big 1.9 trillion of US money. So, that recovery spending could go very significantly to this net zero transition. It's not too late, but it's getting too late. So in terms of key moments, key tipping points, this is one. And what we've done is to analyze who's been doing well. You can see in the 2x2 matrix some countries that are leading the crop, perhaps those that you might expect, I don't know. Countries that are missing opportunities and that they've already spent or allocated large amounts to recovering their economies, but not a lot of it's been green. Countries that still have the potential to move, and others who have moved already on the green front, but still have more possibly to spend. And I think in a sense, partly why we're doing this analysis is that, as I go back to the point about beliefs, and they relate to information, if you have a recognition across global society as a whole, that this is a key moment, these moments come once in a decade, you stuff it up now, you don't get another moment for a decade, then we need to be tracking this, be monitoring it, and be shouting from the rooftops about who is doing the right thing here and who is missing the opportunity. So that's one I just wanted to highlight. The other one, just building very briefly on a point Tim made. You have these dynamics within technologies. More solar gives you cheaper solar, gives you more solar, and batteries and so on. And then you have these cross technology dynamics, which Tim also mentioned. More batteries gives you cheaper cars, cheaper EVs, which means more batteries, and then actually they increase the value of your solar and so on. What I wanted to say is that if you take those dynamics and you embed them in the kind of models that I think Tim was referring to, what you find, this is going back to the point about beliefs and narratives. If you take a conventional view to the decline in costs here from the IEA, forecasted forwards, I'm sure many of you will have seen these forecasts before. I won't belabor how inaccurate they've been. And if you track that into the global final energy mix, then you have a picture that says, you know, the solar here, which is blue, sorry, I've cut off the label there, but isn't a huge chunk of the energy system in 2040. And emissions, you know, perhaps have declined, but they're still pretty high. Whereas if you take a more evidence-based view of the future projection of solar costs using standard statistical and econometric methods, and then you embed that in exactly the same model, this is the sort of energy future you're looking at with vast amounts of solar in it. And if you believe that is the sort of future you're going to, why would you be investing in coal or gas or other fossil infrastructure that has a 30, 40, or even a 20-year lifespan? So let me wrap up with the point that these different tipping elements or sensitive intervention points do interact potentially in fantastically, dynamically helpful ways. The technology triggers a belief, which triggers capital flows, which supports the technology, which reinforces the belief, and so on and so forth. So I'm as optimistic actually now as I've ever been that these positive socioeconomic tipping points or feedback effects might just outrun John's rather nasty physical climate feedbacks and tipping points. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Cameron. So I will follow up. Yeah, it has been really inspiring, and I think I kind of broadly can join this kind of enthusiastic and optimistic vision. So 1 year ago, we published a paper on social tipping dynamics. Actually, was really similar. All the results were very similar to what you were talking about. And it's actually amazing that in this time, I mean, since we published this article, I've got so much positive reactions, yeah, and it's actually a bit kind of overwhelming that Fridays for Future movement leaders, or also climate educators, but also financial investors are really now contacting me and writing me emails and kind of confirming how helpful it was, and also kind of reporting what is happening. So sometimes I'm really amazed that there's so much happening, and sort of maybe kind of connecting to what John was talking about, that at the time when he was working on the tipping elements in the climate system, you kind of did not expect that the changes in the climate system will be so fast. So in a way, maybe it's similar, that maybe we are getting to a point where also changes in the social system are faster than we expected this. But of course, there are also many barriers and many problems to deal with. Like among some problems I see is this kind of lack of approaches in social sciences, but also in economics, to actually analyze those non-linearities and to understand, like, even kind of if you talk about kind of statistical models, they're mostly based on sort of like linear regression, so it's linear, yes. So you are kind of not able to detect non-linearities in the data or in the systems you are analyzing, and I think it's yeah, we definitely need more of those kind of or maybe this kind of complex system approaches to understand what is happening, also to understand how to navigate the system better. Like I will maybe share just one slide from our paper. I hope it's visible, because okay, I'll try to put it in the format. These are the results of the article that we published. So we carried out a survey with international experts and also workshops, and we asked them what could be kind of social systems elements where you can expect those kind of non-linear changes to happen, that could of course lead to a global decarbonization. And of course, these are only sort of candidates for social tipping elements. So this is sort of like or kind of non-exclusive list. So I think much more is happening, and also like what Cameron, you were talking about, that you come up with a list of 40 interventions, and I think it's amazing. So definitely, no, this is not everything. But sort of what I was missing a bit in your, but also in Tim's presentation is that you are kind of talking mostly about those kind of slow or fast system changes, so kind of changes in the financial market, but also kind of technology changes. And what the experts in our research brought as well is that also those kind of slow system changes are very important. So like, for instance, changes in the education system, or also norms and values system. Yes, so sort of they are very important for kind of stabilizing this kind of newly emerging system. Yes, so if you kind of disregard those kind of slow system changes, the system might kind of bounce back to the previous state. In the kind of in this norms and value on this norms and values level. So there's a recognition of the more implications of fossil fuels. It's very important. So like that you feel bad if you actually drive a kind of standard car, for instance, or if you use fossil fuel energy in general. But also there's an education system that's sort of, that more attention has to be spent on climate education. And educating this kind of like new generation of future leaders. That is actually kind of happening also right now with Fridays for Future. And also what the experts were talking about, these are those windows of opportunity. So kind of there are those feedbacks from the Earth system that are kind of unpredictable, but they should be used much more. And kind of these are the kind of short moments where people are very sensitive to possible risks, and like sharp policy changes are possible then. Yeah, I will stop here and sort of, yeah, exactly, sort of like, so what's, Cameron, your opinion about those kind of slow system changes? So those norms and value system and yeah, education, like you were mentioning the narratives, like have you also kind of come across such results, or yeah, it would be great to hear what you think.
Thanks, Ilona. And your paper with various colleagues here, I see, is a really important one, an excellent one. And I think these slow feedback effects, slow dynamics are very important. In a sense, the best time to start to trigger them was 20 or 30 years ago, and the second best time is right now. But actually, we are benefiting right now from some of these effects having been triggered a decade ago. I don't know about all of you, but I've been asking my class, various classes that I teach at Oxford every year, what percentage of the classroom is vegan or vegetarian? And about 10 years ago, it was almost none. And these days, it's the sole guy who's eating meat who needs to explain himself to the rest of the class. So the kind of norms of what's acceptable behavior have just radically shifted in that time. And I guess that takes me to a thought I had about these slower dynamics, is that I'm not actually sure that they are fundamentally slower. And given how little time we have to play with here, I'd be tempted not to kind of stick them in a basket that says kind of slow, but ask ourselves, how could we accelerate that education process, accelerate that process of shifting norms as to what's acceptable and what isn't? And sometimes I think these things can, I mean, I understand why they're in that box. There's lots of evidence that actually it takes generational shifts sometimes to change norms. But there are other instances where actually what was okay 5 years ago is actually not okay anymore. And I think a bit like what Tim is doing so nicely with Simon Sharp, let's understand these dynamics and then not assume that any of it is fixed, and try and find those interventions that we can make to just nudge things along, or just more than nudge, just slam them along much faster, because we don't have lots of time left. But it's great work that you've done there, and we're the better for it.
Yeah, maybe one more question about those kind of minorities that can tip the majority. So what also kind of what we observed in our research, and what is kind of the tipping elements or social tipping elements that we describe in our paper, what they have in common is that that you observe this phenomena, that there are those kind of small kind of committed minorities of like 9 to 25%, depend on the kind of social system or the network structure in the subsystem. But they are able to actually to change the majority of the society. So it's kind of amazing, yeah, that kind of like small groups can change the society, and of course it can also be dangerous. And think about the right-wing populist movement. Yeah, but I wonder, do you also see such similarities in your research, or maybe what is also happening in the UK, that kind of like small groups are driving those changes?
Yeah, I think, and I'll be brief because I know Oliver wants us to move on, but I think it's really important to actually track public attitudes and track these kind of pockets of minority beliefs, which I know the UK government is now doing in public attitudes trackers. And it's striking how some of those have changed quite radically. Not that long ago, a majority of the UK hadn't even heard of net zero. And you point that out to scientists, and they're like, what? Most of the country does not know what net zero is. And actually now people do. And that's moved partly because of pronouncements of the Prime Minister and others, and legislating around it. But to your point, understanding the dynamics of opinion formation, you can actually quantitatively, and we're doing some work on this using Twitter data, identify what happens when different beliefs bump into one another, and how not everybody's going to be a Greta Thunberg, but actually if you do build that small and committed minority and then get yourself amplified, as one thing I say when people say, what can I do? Don't assume that an individual can't do anything. You might happen to be on the margin in the sense that you are the tipping set. So, keep working away at it. And with that, I guess I should probably hand back to Oliver, who's been direct messaging me to say, let's move this along.
Only in the interest of hearing from all the other people, Cameron, not in any
way
hearing from you. We're now going to have two solo contributions from the realms of economics and politics. I used to have a boss who, when we were looking for a cover of The Economist and weren't quite sure where to go, he'd say, is there a number with trillion in it involved? There's a number with trillion in it involved. That will go on the cover very nice. The readers like a trillion. And on that basis, I commend to you the thoughts of Peter Bakker, who is the president and CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and as such has some claim to representing a group of companies with a revenue of more than $8.5 trillion, which would look good on anybody's cover. Peter is a commissioner of the Global Commission on Business and Sustainable Development. He's done a huge amount in this area to bring people together and to get conversations going, and it'll be very interesting to hear what he has to say on the matter. Coming straight after him, we'll have Manjana Milkoreit, who's a researcher at Purdue University, and who combines ideas about international relations and cognitive theory in interesting ways that apply very strongly to both the climate in general and to these particular issues I think that we're discussing. And she brings a good temporal perspective here, in that two of her projects at the moment are looking at the role of future thinking and thinking about the future, while at the same time reviewing the question of what the Paris Agreement's mechanisms have actually brought about so far. So we're going to have brief discussions from those two, and then we will convene in a virtual way the panel and start asking them some of the questions that you've been so helpfully putting into the chat. So first, Peter, if you will.
Great, thank you very much for having me. I have to be honest, I'm rather intimidated by this Zoom room. It's probably the highest density of brain power I've ever met on Zoom. So I'm just a practitioner, so I'll give you my reflections on what all this may mean for business. If we talk about tipping points, you know, the information you just shared basically leads to two questions. First, what could these tipping points mean for the current business models in terms of resilience, in terms of risks? The second looks at the opportunity side. You know, if this is the world we're going to live in, the transformations we need, what are the types of actions, products, services, and solutions that businesses can develop now? So let me focus my reflections on what are the positive tipping points that business can help drive, and how can we turn this into action? Now, we need small interventions that can accelerate large-scale actions to deal with the three most pressing issues of our time. And we've identified them as the climate emergency, the loss of nature, and inequality. And I'm very pleased to see actually that in your Nobel Prize Summit, you've selected the same three pillars. Each of these can on its own endanger the safe operating space for humanity as well, and that's of course relevant for business, the license to operate. And if there's one thing we've learned from COVID, it is how interconnected these things are and how ill-prepared our systems actually are to the shocks they may bring. I would like all of you to be very aware how important your work is. You know, the IPCC 1.5 report, I think it was the end of 2018, that in itself is a tipping point. It's science-based translation that we need to move to a world of net zero by no later than 2050, that we need to halve emissions by 2030, has really changed the conversation in business. There are now more and more businesses setting net zero targets. And an organization like mine, the WBCSD, has now set net zero as one of its membership criteria. We brought this to a vote for the members. More than 90% of the companies have approved this as a criterion for membership in the organization. 2 years ago, prior to the IPCC report, that would have been unthinkable. So the challenge now is, how can we focus business on the opportunities to create these positive sustainability tipping points? And for that, we figured we needed a shared vision. So it's actually quite timely that I'm here, because only last Thursday, WBCSD published what we call Vision 2050, Time to Transform. A report developed over the past 2 years with more than 40 global businesses and a strong external review committee, of which, amongst others, Johan Rockström was one of the members. The vision in there is 9+ billion people living well within the planetary boundaries by mid-century. And this report, and I'll later on put it in the chat for a link, has been signed off by the CEOs of 40 leading companies in the world. Achieving this, of course, is not as simple as the word suggests. We need wholesale transformation, and that's where the concept of system transformation comes in. Everybody who works in sustainability these days is talking about system transformations. This report tries to make it actionable. 9 pathways of system transformation written in a language that any board can look at and turn into their business strategy. We hope that these pathways will inspire these positive tipping points. Because we know that business has a central role to play in bringing products to markets and therefore lead these transformations. Each of these also have an opportunity to identify the so-called S-curve adoption models, where positive tipping points start with early adopters, move into quicker uptake, and finally make it to mass market. On energy, the topic that we talked about, climate, the vision is we can power a net zero world with sustainable energies, with a sustainable energy system that provides reliable and affordable net zero carbon energy for all. There are 4 shifts in behavior and demand here could potentially form a positive S-curve. So the first one is decarbonizing the global energy system moves up on the political agenda, driven by widespread public activism, the Greta Thunbergs of the world, which will lead to ambitious policy action to support zero carbon energy carriers, including carbon pricing, energy taxation, and the likes. The second would be business increasingly switches to net zero or zero carbon energy. A range of different sectors come to rely on technology that needs clean energy, creating further demand. The third one is significant players in the global economy, mainly the financial sector, continues to divest from fossil fuel related activities to support the transition to net zero. And finally, public awareness campaigns, education initiatives, and advertising will empower people with better information on the energy they use. Similar S-curves and tipping points can be identified in the food system, which of course needs to move to a healthy world with a regenerative and equitable food system, producing healthy, safe, and nutritious food for all. Given the time, I'll spare you all the S-curves there, but this is one where I think more is asked from science. We actually need an IPCC for the food system, and we need it urgently, because we're currently preparing for the Food System Summit that the UN is organizing, which is, I would say, equally, if not more important than even the COP26. But the science is not yet as robust as it is in the climate space. And you must believe from me that the concept of science-based targets is the fastest mobilizer of business action of all. Yet, all these transformations are not just about engineers fixing technological transformations. We really need mindset shifts. Maybe you call that norm shifts, but we have used the language of mindset shifts. Three we have actually identified: regeneration, resilience, and reinvention. And that's where I may want to stop my reflections, because the most critical mindset shift that is out there, and probably the biggest tipping point of all tipping points on the positive side, is the reinvention of capitalism. We need to move to an economic system with incentives, accounting standards, capital market valuations that are no longer just based on financial performance of business, but integrates the impact on people, planet, as part of how we define success, how we calculate enterprise valuation, the so-called internalization of externalities. The move to capitalism of true value is going to be the fastest accelerator for 9+ billion people to all live well within the boundaries. And that's where we need to work closely together with science, partly to drive innovation, partly to get new theories. Because today, there's a lot of movement on the capitalism economic side of the equation. We're not too far away from an announcement that the Sustainable Standards Board will be set up by the IFRS, the body that sets the accounting rules. That will focus all companies in the world on so-called ESG, environmental, social metrics, non-financial metrics. We are nowhere when it comes to the economic theory of how non-financial items impact financial valuations. And we urgently need to move there, because unless we make that shift, none of our alarm bells will ring loud enough to overcome the power of capital markets. So yes, I want to thank all of you for the amazing work you do. Please consider business on your side to turn your thinking into action. It's time to transform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I guess I'll take over from here. Thank you, everybody, for being here and joining in this very important conversation. I have been invited to share some policymaker perspectives regarding all of what we have heard so far. And I will try to use a few minutes, not too much time, to actually add something to the rich conversation we've already had. And like Peter, I will use most of my time to focus on the opportunities related to the, let's say, social and economic tipping point concept that has generated so much energy, including this event here. But I want to start with actually the opportunities created by the consolidating knowledge we have about climate tipping points. And I want to point out that over the last 15, 20 years, we have learned so much about them that we are in a place where policymakers should be able to use that knowledge or have the opportunity to use, as John said, intervention time that we now see or know about to start thinking about the governance and response to potential climate tipping points, right? We do have some intervention time. And given the complexity that is presented by tipping points, their diversity, the very unique temporal dimensions, and the remaining uncertainty, we have to think very hard about what to do from a, let's say, anticipatory governance perspective. What should be done is really not clear, given that we know these are likely, these are close, and these are events that are to some extent already ongoing. So what does this mean for policy and governance is unclear. And some of my own work shows that tipping point knowledge and understanding is really poorly developed among decision makers, especially at the global scale. They lack understanding and they lack focus on this particular category of events. And so therefore we are woefully underprepared to think about, let's say, early warning systems or even governance tools and mechanisms that could address prevention, preparation, or management and navigation of climate tipping points. So that is the first big opportunity that so far policymakers haven't picked up, and we need to think hard about why that is, whether that is because, like rate of change, it might be a concept that is really difficult to grapple with, or there might be other reasons why it's simply really tough to adopt this language and this idea in a governance context like the Paris Agreement, where it just isn't visible. So that's my brief point about the climate tipping points. And now let's try and talk a bit about the social and economic tipping points that have created so much writing and thinking recently. So from a policymaker perspective, this is of course exciting, right? This is, whether it's tipping points, sensitive intervention points, leverage points, and now combined with the idea of cascades of nonlinear change towards decarbonization. This is a, let's say, concept that's most welcome for policymakers who are struggling with a timeline that's increasingly tight, right? And so we are seeing that this is driven, maybe this research is to some extent driven by an observed need for knowledge about how do we still get to the goals that seem to be moving further and further away from us. And therefore also maybe driven by a certain hope or desire to find nonlinear change processes in social systems just because they are so necessary. We need to move more rapidly, and we haven't yet observed the nonlinear change over the last decades of trying. So here is a desire and a hope and what I call the sustainability imperative of nonlinear change, maybe. And so therefore I would be also a little cautious, because the science we are presenting is very much geared towards providing policymakers and decision makers with new tools to grapple with the increasingly tight timeline. But we need to be careful if what we're promising and what's actually possible. Because from my reading, while this is exciting, I haven't yet seen a lot of empirical work that suggests this is actually something we can see and we understand. There have been limited studies that are giving us reasons to believe that is worth looking into, and it is interesting. Most of these focus on heavily technical, technological systems, but there is much less work that looks into what all of us have agreed is really important to this process, and that's changing norms, values, mindsets, and worldviews that underlie all of our current systems. And once we mess with those, I think we have way less understanding, first of all, how those systems actually change, and whether nonlinear or social tipping processes actually exist, and whether we're able to generate them. That's a whole different ballgame than the climate tipping points, where we're like worried about prevention. Here we're talking about let's generate them, right? That's a very different conversation we're having. And so moving from that reason for concern to reason for optimism within the same conceptual use, jumping from the natural science to social sciences is really interesting, but driven by the sustainability imperative. But let's be cautious about this. So a big question mark that policymakers would probably have is, tell me how common these things are. Is this big? Is this something I need to look for and just have on my radar all the time? Is this something I should expect to be possible in all the systems I'm dealing with? Or like in the climate system, the argument tends to be these are rare events, right? And thankfully so. If we had tipping processes all the time, we'd be in big trouble. So in natural systems, usually the stabilizing feedbacks are stronger, and we have on rare occasions we see tipping processes where this kind of thing happens. So how common should I expect this to be in social systems? And then currently it seems like the research is looking for these social tipping dynamics or leverage points in systems that can make a big difference for decarbonization, that can get us there fast. Are those, what is the reason to believe that those are the ones most prone to nonlinear change? Given, I mean, we have decades of history of social science looking into social change that hasn't used this language. Have they not seen it? And why now do we think in those particular systems that are so important for decarbonization, we are confident that this can happen? So how common are they? And you're giving me a lot of, or policymakers, language around complex systems. It hasn't come out so strongly in the presentations, but it's very fundamental for all the papers. And policymakers do not live in a policy world and policy logics that are based on complex systems thinking. So if we want them to make choices that focus, or that first of all understand how complex systems function and how they're different from the world that they currently perceive to be changing or trying to shape, then I think we have to consider a whole lot of capacity building among policymakers for what complex systems actually do. What is a critical state? How do I see or know when a system turns critical? And that is hard for us scientists to do, I believe. There's a lot of work to be done even among us. I don't think we're very good at even predicting when the climate tipping points are happening. We have some confidence ranges, right? But really there's a lot that remains to be explained and understood. But for social systems, even more so. So how do we know when a system becomes critical or close to tipping? Or how do we understand how we move that system towards tipping? So there's a lot about complex systems that is challenging, and I think we need to not just have patience, but maybe provide that. How do we provide the support to policymakers that will be needed to grapple with complex systems language and shifting their perspective of the world in that way? Deliberate tipping. What gives us confidence we can do this? I mean, in the natural systems where we have observed this very clearly, right, we have very good analyses that tells us these are processes that do happen in natural systems. And we're concerned that we are doing this not accidentally, but that we're not able to prevent it when it comes to large Earth systems. But what gives us the ability to tip, let's say, mind shift changes, and also the right to do so when it comes to social systems? I think there are lots of ethical questions we haven't even raised. But let's say, can we, and how can we? Who is responsible for doing the deliberate, intentional tipping of certain systems? And there's a big question, I think, of scale mismatch possibly between how we have organized our social systems and political power compared to the kinds of systems that are open or prone to nonlinear change. Sometimes, and if there's a big mismatch, how do people know they're in charge, or that they have the ability or should be or could be engaged in moving a system toward a tipping point? So that question of who and with what tools, I think is completely open, and policymakers will be looking for lots of answers. I have concern about predictability and control, that the idea that we can deliberately tip large social systems, complex systems, and that we could control or navigate such a process seems a little risky to me, given how little we seem to be currently even understanding how to control natural systems in the same sense, and the increased complexity of social systems where you have, I don't know, the dimension of consciousness and human agency seems, there's just a lot of questions that raises in terms of, are we really thinking that this is something we can do already, and what does it take, especially when we're talking about value systems, belief systems, and so forth. But I think there's a key concept that is really attractive to me in all of what I've heard, and that is the idea of amplification mechanisms, whether that's feedbacks or anything else. Any strategy that can help us magnify policy choices that we are making and amplify our changes, speed up the processes that we're trying to set in motion, that will be key, and that will be helpful no matter what kind of worldview these policymakers have. So the more we can understand the amplification mechanisms that are available to us, that we already understand, not just when it comes to spreading renewables, but beyond that, what are the amplification mechanisms, the positive feedback effects? And if in social systems we can even generate new ones, right? We have the power to actually create new feedback effects. We can create new actors, we can create new processes and institutions. So how do we set feedback effects and amplification mechanisms in motion. I think that is a key question where policymakers will be looking for advice and where we can make large contributions from the science community. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Manjana. I'm now going to attempt to convene convene the panel, which is people who have spoken, and put to them questions which I'm going to sort of mostly glean from and slightly repurpose from your various terrific comments on the chat. And I do hope that the organisers are going to archive the chat as well as everything else, because I think it's been a very useful addition to the overall process. So one thing I'm struck by in a general sort of like tipping points and non-linearities in the geophysical, geobiophysical world, bad, social world, possibly a cause for hope, is that in one of these contexts, we're talking about an entity that we conceive of as being stable until forced into a new regime, reacting by ever greater movements along the line of forcing. In the other one, we're talking about what I think we all understand, certainly those of us who frequently use the word Anthropocene understand, to be an unstable system, a system of great acceleration, a system of global capitalism centuries old. Why should we think that in one case we can control the endpoint of the tipping point mechanisms, whereas in the other case we just need to cease them from happening? Why are we so optimistic about social tipping points in this discussion? I wanted to actually start off by asking John that.
Okay. Yeah, interesting question. Actually, why is the natural system so challenging right now? So I provide two reasons. Unfortunately, we are interfering with the climate system in a sort of period or epoch or age of the Earth system where the system is extremely volatile. So if you look over many million years, actually, back in the history of the Earth, and Tim Lenton is the absolute expert on that. I mean, only 3 million years ago, we entered actually the ice age, the glacial cycle period, where the system is wildly fluctuating between glacial system and glacial periods and interglacial or warm periods, actually. Even from the point of view of a complex systems analyst, which I am for 40 years now, this is a very unusual situation, actually. So if we would have made this big intervention by burning all the fossil fuels 20 million years ago, the system would not even have noticed, in a way. So we have picked the most unfortunate point in time to do an intervention. And this is my second reason, which is of course dramatic, because we are oxidizing, it means burning fossil fuels that have accumulated over 300 million years, and we'll do it within 2 centuries. This is a big intervention. So this is again the rate of intervention here. So in a way, two very unfortunate things come together. Now, why should we be more optimistic in the social system? Well, because we can make up our mind on that. It's different from the sort of just non-intentional natural system where things just happen and we pick the wrong period, so to speak. But since we are here, since we're debating this in this seminar, we are a self-referential system. We reflect on our own impacts. And so we can make up our mind, but we want to intervene at the right point, so to speak. It's completely different from a natural system here. So if we are doing the right type of self-referential dynamics, we may emerge actually with the will to do a positive intervention. It's a much more complicated system in the end. And nobody has really analyzed that, but that's the situation we are in. And we can even have disruptive change. I mean, it was mentioned, the educational thing, just one remark. Cameron was referring to that, Ilona was referring to that, what we call the slow variables and so on, and the norms. And when we have Greta Thunberg, when we talk about the educational system, she was not changing the educational system. She was just shattering it by striking and not going to school, actually. This is what you might call in quantum theory a tunneling event. So she was just tunneling actually through the educational system. And this is something which can only be done by human beings based on intelligence, actually. So that's why I'm much more optimistic when we talk about the social fabric.
I think the image of Greta as a quantum tunneling event is one that I certainly will take with me. I think that's wonderful. Ilona, you wanted, I think, to add something there.
Yes. Well, I think maybe Greta in a way is also a product of the educational system. That she learned all those things at school, and then she couldn't cope with this. But what I was going to talk about, that it's exactly kind of the magic, that social. So as a social scientist, I should say that social systems are unpredictable. So you can talk about likelihoods, but you cannot fully predict social systems. And this is actually in a way it might be dangerous, but in a way, it's a chance that we sort of that we do have the agency, that we can foresee the outcomes of our actions. And this is actually the chance that we have, and maybe only the only chance that we have. Because so I did a lot of research actually together with John and my colleagues, also on the impacts of higher degrees of global warming on human systems, and this was really depressing. Yes, so it seems like we are really talking about the end of the kind of human civilization as we know it. If we go beyond 2 degrees and higher, and we get to those kind of 4 degrees global warming levels at the end of the century. So I think it's really the only chance that we have. So I think decision makers and people with high agency, they must understand what is at the stake. Thanks.
Thanks, Ilona. Cameron, I think you want to speak too.
I did. I really enjoyed John's remarks about the tunneling. I was wondering whether Greta's spin was both simultaneously up and down or something. But anyway, I mean, I think that the point about reflexivity, as George Soros calls it, or self-reinforcing beliefs, is really significant here, because it's not just a complex system; it's a complex, adaptive, and self-referential system in the social space. And I just want to pick up on a couple of comments in the chat, because this is why I feel positive about this, because we can reflect on it, we can take action. Gradually, these thoughts are diffusing around the world. Diane Falconer says, can we band together and use our brains to solve this one? I feel so optimistic just because of the quality of the intellects that are now applying themselves to this issue around the world. As an example, we just launched a new MSc at Oxford, and I mean, MScs at Oxford are always hard to get into, but we've had over 400 applicants for 16 places for one course. Like, there are a lot of very smart people who want to work on this problem now, and that's really very exciting. 20 years ago, I was told by a nameless senior professor at Oxford that I had such a great intellect, which is the nice bit of the statement, that I should stop wasting my brain on trivial environmental problems and should work on interest rate theory instead, which was the not so nice bit. And I just can't see anyone saying that actually to a young doctoral student these days. And then Jennifer Hinton's point about shifting the goal of these organizations, well, it's actually Donella Meadows, as she says, is also seriously important. And it's something that we are seeing. Gradually, our institutions are shifting their objective functions. And then you start to marshal the resource and the thinking and the trade-offs get made differently around the Cabinet Office, which is one of the points we make in our Committee on Climate Change report. You need to shift the objectives of these institutions, and we are seeing that happen. So I still feel positive.
Okay, I want to now maybe actually ask Peter and maybe Tim about a similar point about the capitalist system specifically. It's a dynamic system that you want to make part of a stable Earth system. And some of the things that we saw, some of the positive feedbacks we saw, such as, for instance, Cameron's of cheap solar, cheap batteries, cheap EVs, cheap solar, etc. Those depend on a growth model. And various people have brought up in the comments, is it really sustainable to think about a reformed capitalism, a reinvented capitalism, I think you said, Peter, that can fit within an Earth system that is not pushing at tipping points? Maybe Tim first.
You put me on the spot there, Ollie. Yeah, a question I've continued to wrestle with for decades. What I wanted to say to Peter actually is that his plea for a method or a framework to account for what economists would call the unsubstitutable but profound value of nature already exists. I mean, it's literally a way of adapting the standard economics of well-being, or so-called utility functions. Thomas Sterner and others showed how you can quantify, you can put alongside the monetizable, substitutable stuff, the unsubstitutable life support system and its enormous value, and show that it profoundly changes the outcomes. So perhaps it just hasn't escaped the academy yet, but I see no problem in doing that. But of course, what it tells you is what Ollie has already hinted at already, which is, yeah, it tells you that your whole economic paradigm and arguably your whole modernist program is fundamentally flawed and built on assumptions that, like, all we need to do is have a marginal framework where we just move a little bit around this attractor of eternal 2% year-on-year growth. So, Ollie, I remain to be convinced by the evidence that we can actually decouple growth from consumption. Obviously, I've thought quite a lot about this and tried to model it, and I think we can do quite a lot of decoupling, and we could certainly have an abundant source of free energy from sunlight through renewable power, a lot of which I think we'll be putting into what I call Gaia devices or Gaia machines to recycle all the stuff we already have in the economy to make the new stuff in an imagined future. But I fundamentally, for now, I'm going to take the safe ground that we have to find a steady state economics. And Adam Smith knew that. He wrote about it. He thought about it. Other famous figures in the early history of economics spent plenty of time dwelling on that in their texts. We've dutifully forgotten about it as the modernist programs continue to triumph. But I mean, we're all here talking about, yeah, what my friend Bruno Latour would sort of say is recognizing not just our own agency, but the agency of other living things, all trying to create their own conditions for survival and flourishing. That dictates a new politics of landing on Earth, as he puts it. And I'm afraid I'm with him that new politics fundamentally, we have to fundamentally revisit notions of what kind of economics we want within a more holistic framing of collective social goals, I guess. So that's not a direct answer, far from it, but I probably sit in a slightly, possibly I sit in the radical camp here, but I definitely don't think we certainly can't stick with neoliberal capitalism, and arguably we couldn't have stuck with the preceding form of capitalism. That would have trashed the planet just a bit slower. So we've really got to get to the fundamentals. But of course, as everyone's been saying in Donella Meadows' leverage points, you don't want to go to the end of the lever and try and change the paradigm first. That's not the sensible place to start to intervene. You be pragmatic and you start somewhere else on the lever. But those things that you're doing elsewhere on the lever, like this meeting or this conversation, they have these weird knock-on effects that you find yourself starting to change the paradigm. And I think that's where the hope lies.
Peter, what do you think about?
Yeah, I think I probably think a bit simpler about these things. You know, capitalism is quite simple. Everything is discounted cash flow analysis. That's the only thing that makes economies tick. Discounted cash flow analysis work really simple. They look at the cash flow of a business, which is problem number one. It excludes all the non-cash items, i.e. nature, social aspects of business. Secondly, 90% of the market cap of business in the world is terminal value. What is terminal value? It assumes the current cash flows with a constant growth rate into the future for indefinite period, discounted back to dollars or pounds or euros of today. So this assumes there will be no change in the growth patterns. There's 3% terminal growth, and then you discount that to dollars today. That's how we calculate value in today's world. Well, we know two things. There are lots of non-cash impacts, which we therefore exclude. And secondly, we know that in a planet with finite resources, you cannot assume to grow indefinitely. So yes, the current economic model is broken. I liked very much, Jennifer Hinton, you put in something that in order to change the system, you need to change its goal. I actually believe, you know, we cannot measure the success of business in terms of its profit or cash flow, just as we can't measure the success of an economy in simply looking at GDP. We need to find ways to integrate the environmental costs and the social benefits that a business or a country is able to generate. But that's for that, as far as I'm aware, and maybe it's in your academy, Tim, but I'm not aware of a pragmatic tool that a business person could use to do that, or that an investor could use to change his DCF calculation. And our concept of growth needs to change. If a business or anyone is lowering its negative environmental impact, it should be seen as a profit or growth. If you are able to reduce inequality, you get a social profit or growth. So growth is not the enemy. The definition of what you include in growth or in profit or in GDP is what needs to change.
Ilona, I think you have something to add here.
Yes, no, I just wanted to comment what Peter was talking about. So yeah, I think it's really really great, very interesting. But I think a part of the problem is that the type of education or knowledge that economics and business administration students learn. So I have some friends in that group, and many they learn only this kind of neoliberal economics. And I have a friend who's doing now an MBA program, and she said, there's actually kind of nothing about climate change. So they even have a course on business ethics, and there's no like environmental issues mentioned there. So I think it's a part of this, and maybe there was this question about the role of science in this, what is happening in scientists. So I think we really need to also focus on the education programs, especially the education of economics and business students. And sort of like maybe like one more comment is that neoliberal economics, but also most of kind of commonly used approaches in social sciences, they emerged in the second part of the 20th century, which was like a very stable period of time where you had this kind of constant growth, and I think those approaches they kind of just don't take into account that nonlinear changes or also kind of crises can happen. So sort of like always crises come as a surprise to economists. Yes, I think it's a part of the problem that this is just kind of not taught at the universities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ilona. Pedro, if you'd like to put your question into the chat, that would be really helpful. I wanted to ask a question about a question that came from Nadia, I think, in the chat, which was everyone seems to be banging on about positive feedbacks where change drives more change in the same direction. But we know from life that there's a lot of negative feedbacks. She brings out what's sometimes called the rebound effect or the Jevons effect. I wanted to ask basically anyone from the panel What's the negative feedback you hope for in the Earth system and the negative feedback that you fear in the social system? Open question. Anyone can go. If you don't, I'm going to start nominating.
Okay. We have been searching in the Earth system for negative feedbacks for 4 decades now, I guess. And we have found almost nothing. There are some marginal ones, second order ones, but it seems that we are in a stage of the planetary machinery where the negative feedbacks are very rare, actually. I mean, they kick in, of course, at large temperature change. So when you go into 8 or 10 degrees warming, you find some. Otherwise, we would go down the Venus trajectory, and that will probably not happen. But in the current stage, they are very rare. So we need actually human beings, in a way, are the only negative feedback I see. After we are driving the system nuts, actually we feel that we have to do something about it. And based on these insights, our projections and so on, based on this webinar, we decide to act as a negative feedback. That's the only thing I see. Now, what do I fear in the social system under conventional circumstances? I mean, the most definite and the most powerful actually force is just procrastination, I think. That is our biggest enemy. But you think, Manjana, tomorrow, no offense to Manjana here. I mean the Spanish word, tomorrow. But we still think there is another day, we can wait and so on. And this is precisely what happened to the captain of the Titanic in a way. But although he had to decide within a minute, but he thought he still has a little bit time to make the right decision. So acting based on fragmented or incomplete knowledge, willing to act, having the courage to act based on sort of restricted insight, that is what we need to do, because as I showed you, the intervention time and the reaction time are approaching each other. So we either act now based on incomplete knowledge, or we should rather leave it and actually let the world go down the drain.
Okay, I'm going to try and move through things quite quickly now, but Cameron, Ilona, and Manjana all have their hands up, and I think Manjana isn't just wanting to defend the details of tomorrow. Cameron, please.
Just 2 quick social ones that I worry about. So dampening effects, feedback effects that could slow the transition. One is that we don't take the inequality piece seriously enough. And actually you have a very large number of people who feel excluded or not included by the transition, and they block it or they resist it. I mean, it's the yellow vest sort of feedback effect, except on a much larger scale. The second one is that there are obviously major transitions happening in electricity systems. Everybody's very excited about batteries, etc. But there's this seasonal long-term, it's not just seasonal, it's a 1 in kind of 10 year or 1 in 20 year challenge of storing enough electricity to make sure that power systems keep functioning. Now you might think, well, it's a black swan event, who really cares about that? But actually we've got 20 or 30 years to run before this transition's done. And if we have a series of Texas-like blackouts where it is clearly actually because we haven't sorted the management of power systems in a high penetration renewables world, then I think that could really slow us down in a fairly big way. So that's one of the things I worry about that we're working on.
Ilona?
Yes, so my fear is kind of the right-wing movements, but also kind of the sphere of strangers and in general maybe also like fear as an emotion. So I also do research about the effects of different emotions. So kind of, also fear-induced messaging, also kind of in the climate change context, it leads to kind of closing people, people close themselves and they don't engage in cooperative action. and kind of the emotions that you need for collective action, kind of to bring people together. It's like enthusiasm, for instance, also anger, but maybe anger is a bit dangerous. But I think exactly this fear, emotions, and also this kind of polarization, fake news, right-wing movements. These are kind of the negative feedbacks that I am kind of personally afraid of. Thanks.
And Manjana.
Let me build on that comment by Ilona. Humans have a tendency to resist change, especially when that change threatens who they are, when it speaks to our core values and our identities. And so we've seen lots of tendencies to resist responses to climate change that are driven by those mechanisms that are either we're defending profitability, a value in our business communities, right? Or we're actually defending identities and beliefs and ideology, something we've seen with climate skepticism. And at its worst, that kind of negative feedback, the defense of the status quo, because of who I am and what I value, can also turn into violence. I mean, that is not the first thing to happen, but that is something that I am worried about, that ultimately, given that we want to push these systems fast away from where they are now, the people's ability to handle that kind of push and change, nonlinear change, is limited. And they will resist it, and they will fight it with different means. And depending on how strong they have current values embedded in the systems that we live in, be that capitalism or anything else, there will be resistance, and that could be violent. That's what I'm worried about.
Thank you very much. I think that leads on to the area where I'd like to finish up, because with your indulgence, I'm running slightly late. We started a little bit late, but it was actually a point that Manjana brought up, which I think Laura brought up also in the chat. Two linked points, actually. One is the question of whether by hoping for the good social feedbacks to run to completion, you are to some extent assuming in the equitable world that you want to have as a result. One of the examples given was that electric vehicles in South Africa are not currently driving a solar power revolution. But the other one, I think, more deep point, which I see as linked, but I'm not going to take the time to explain that because I would use up all our time anyway, is a question that Manjana raised about democracy. If you can engineer social tipping points, what gives any particular group the right so to do? Is it just first come, first served? Where does the moral dimension of politics and the constitutional dimension enter into this sort of discussion? Tim has held up his physical.
I have. I just wanted to respond, Ollie, by saying that I think maybe we're focusing a little bit too much on what we might loosely call top-down policy-driven positive tipping points or social tipping points, and not enough on the agency of all of us to drive disruptive change from the bottom up, which of course we have referred to Greta. We could also refer, in the case of Australia, to the fact that Australia turned its back 10 years ago on a sort of top-down policy planned clean energy, etc. transition, and instead a revolution has been happening from the bottom up, a very disruptive uptake of solar PV across amongst the citizens, basically, and the policy is frantically trying to catch up. So the point is a broader one, and it goes back to Gaia, Latour, and my own preferred view of the world, which is like all living things, we have the agency to create our own conditions for survival and flourishing, and we will, I think, all continue to be doing that from the bottom up and in communities and in new collectives that we form. And I think that's the democratization, if you like, or the empowering dimension of these positive tipping points, is that many of them are already coming from the bottom up, where they've always come from life and innovation. And they have profound implications, certainly, but we're democratizing our energy, our source of power, through the transformation to renewables. And who knows what the political ramifications of that are, but we well know from other scholars like Tim Mitchell how the very geopolitically and geographically limited locations of fossil fuel reserves shaped modern democracies. So I'm quietly confident for sure that the unfolding positive tipping points are going to reshape future democracies, but I'm not going to make a prediction on that.
Okay. Ilona.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to give this example of citizen councils in the UK. Maybe our British colleagues can talk more about it. But I think in a way, like scientists or most of scientists are actually really, or would be really bad decision makers, and maybe this would result in some sort of technocratic system that maybe would not be better. But actually, I think we need more participatory processes. We actually need citizens to decide collectively actually how we are going to decarbonize, or which decarbonization options are likely to work better for any given community. Yeah, I think we need more participation, and this is I think very important. Okay, I stop here for the sake of time.
I think that's very decent of you, Ilona. And so the last two contributions, I'm going to go to John first, and then at the end, Manjana. So, John.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I think Manjana raised a number of really, really important points. It would be fun to respond to that, actually, from the point of a systems scientist, the point of view of a systems scientist. So hopefully we can do this another time. On the question of an open society versus a sort of top-down society, autocratic, like in China, for example, where you probably only have to convince some people in the Communist Party or so on. So let's talk about democracy and open society. What I came to the conclusion over many years now that the best thing you can do, you can try, and this is not something where you hurt anybody else or where you are not doing something legitimate within democratic boundary conditions. I think the best thing you can do is to come up with a really good story, a really good narrative, actually, which can infect everybody else. And I found in my life that the people who are well-meaning just tell the better stories than the ill-meaning people.
Manjana.
What a burden to have the last comment, but I feel it's important to raise a point that Laura Pereira in the comments earlier raised as well, and that is that different people have different visions of a desirable future. And even if you run participation processes, which by the way have very practical limitations, especially if you want to be fast, you might ultimately have different visions of the future. And you might have responses that do not align with what science tells us needs to happen and in the temporal dimensions it needs to happen. What do we do then? This is political. This is different kinds of interests and different kinds of values. So what kinds of processes help us align our future thinking, our future visions, our values with rapid change processes? I think that is really challenging, and I haven't seen anything that helps us do that yet, other than having these conversations and creating really narratives that lots of folks can buy into, even those who might resist that change very viscerally. So
I think that is a lovely point to end on, that diversity does present us with challenges, but also with all the opportunities that we can take, in that none of us beforehand knows anything like the best ways forward, and it's only by comparing and contrasting viewpoints as we have today, and as I hope we'll continue to do, and we'll do at the Nobel Symposium, that we can see the stories of progress that John asked us to tell. So thank you all very much for your contributions. It's been a huge pleasure and an honor to chair your conversation, and I'll now pass over to Holger to talk us all out.
Yes, thank you very much, Oliver, for your excellent moderation, and thanks to everyone, the presenters, as well as all the comments and questions that you posed. I think it was a very exciting webinar that I think did justice to the title, that a better understanding of tipping points can really help us to use them for sustainability transitions, not being only subject to these scary biophysical transitions that are looming, but that we also can shape actively the positive ones in socioeconomic institutions, policies, and so on for a better future. Sure, they come with many challenges, the complex systems and all the uncertainties they bring don't make it easy to predict. There are many obstacles. There's this procrastination that is challenged by the urgency of the situation, very different contexts that we have in different parts of the world that don't allow for simple solutions. But we have heard a lot about opportunities moving on from simple technological fixes to changes in bigger systems such as food system, communication system, and all that. We must obviously use opportunities, windows of opportunities, such as the current Building Back Better opportunity. And in particular, we need strong science that reaches out to all societal sectors, to policymaking, decision-making, and to all the citizens to link knowledge to practice. And with that, we are really at the core of the Nobel Prize Summit. And I would invite you all to go to the website of the Nobel Prize Summit and also log on to some of the events that are upcoming before and during the summit from 26 to 28 April. With that, I would then also like to finish off. Many thanks to all of you. And it was a very, very rich discussion that we had. I was quite impressed by having more than 150 participants and more than 100 staying on even beyond the official end of it. That's quite remarkable. So many thanks to all of you. Have a good evening or good day. Bye then.